2 years ago, I made a government co-op Iceberg, which was having a positive review in there. So, as you may know, I love to read books and I prefer a crime espionage novel, especially in examples such as John Le Carre, Stieg Larsson, James Ellroy, or in the crime fiction work by the famous Stephen King. But today, they found a disturbing type of novel, titled Disturbing Novel Iceberg. And in today's video, we will covering that. And now let's begin. It was a Stephen King horror epic novel following the experience of 7 children as they are terrorized by an evil entity that exploits that fear of its victim to disguise itself while hunting their prey. Pet Sematary is another Stephen King novel that follows the story of Louis Creed, a doctor who moved with his family, wife Rachel and daughter Ellie and son Gage, to a rural houses in Ludlow, Maine, nearby as a pet cemetery where local children bury their deceased pet. The Yellow Wallpaper is a short story by Sharon Perkins Gilman about a young woman and her husband who imposed a rest cure on her when she suffered temporary nervous depression after the birth of their baby. First published in January 1892 in the New England magazine, it is considered an important early work of American feminist literature for elucidating women's attitude toward mental and physical health in the 19th century. It is also lauded as an excellent work of horror fiction. Pharaohs in the Didactic was a 1979 novel by V.C. Andrew. It is the first book in the Dollar Ganger series, followed the story of the 4 children who, with their seemingly kind and loving mother, lead to the mansion of her very wealthy parent. Upon arrival, the innocent children are forced into a brutal condition, being restricted to the claustrophobic attic with only the malicious grandmother as communication to the outer world. Watership Down is an adventure novel by British author Richard Adams about the rabbit as they escape the destruction of their warren and seek a place to establish a new home, encountering period and temptation along the way. The novel was famous for the 1978 film adaptation directed by Martin Rosen. It gains controversy for its graphic, violent, and disturbing depiction of rabbit being killed and maimed. The Amityville Horror is a novel by Jay Anson. It follows the Lutz family experience when they moved into a new home and were intensely haunted by the spirit there. Cthulhu Mythos is a mythophobia and a shared fiction universe that originated in the works of American horror writer H.P. Lovecraft. The Invisible Man is an 1897 science fiction novel by H.G. Wells, followed the story of a scientist who has devoted himself to research into optics and who invents a way to change a body refractive index to air so that it neither absorb or reflect light. He carried out this protocol on himself and rendered himself invisible, but failed in his attempt to reverse it. Dracula is one of Bram Stoker's most famous novels. Follow the story of vampire Count Dracula and his attempt to move from Transylvania to England to spread the undead curse. Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde follow the story of Gabriel John Utterson, a London-based legal practitioner who investigating a series of strange occurs between his old friend Dr. Henry Jekyll and a murderous criminal named Edward Hyde. Silence of the Lambs was a Thomas Harris sequel novel to the 1981 novel Red Dragon. Both books feature the cannibalistic serial killer and man-bearing psychiatrist Dr. Hannibal Lecter. This time, however, he is pitted against FBI trainee Carrie Starling as she works to solve the case of a Buffalo Bill serial killer. The novel was made famous for the movie adaptation starring Jodie Foster and Anthony Hopkins. It won 5 Academy Awards, including Best Picture, Best Director, Best Actor, Best Actress, and Best Adapted Screenplay. All Quiet on the Western Front was an anti-war novel that brutally examined the Western Front during the First World War from the perspective of the German army. 1984 is a dystopian novel about a world ruled by a totalitarian regime. The book was a realistic look at the totalitarian regime that was inspired from the Nazi Germany, the Soviet Union, and the Fascist Italy, and also was a quietly be warning about the threat to the democracy. Turn of the Screw was an 1898 Gothic horror novella by Henry James. It was collected into the Two Magic, published by Macmillan in New York City and Heinemann in London. The novella followed a governess who, caring for 2 children at a remote country house, became convinced that they are haunted. The turn of the school consists of work of the both gothic and horror fiction. The Haunting of Hill Houses is a 1959 horror novel by Jerry Jackson about Dr. Montage, interested in the paranormal, who invites himself and a few guests to a supposedly haunted house to stay for a while and investigating. Frankenstein was a novel by Mary Shelley about a gifted scientist, Victor Frankenstein, who succeeded in giving life to being his creation. Follows for Agelon is a short story by Daniel Keyes about Agelon, a laboratory mouse who has undergone surgery to increase his intelligence. The story is told through a series of progress reports written by Charles Lee Gordon, the first human subject for the surgery. Coraline is a New Gaiman's children's horror novel about a girl named Coraline who finds a strangely similar home, but better and more morbid. Gone Girl is one of Gillian Flynn's most famous books. It follows the story of Nick Dunn, a mid-30-year-old man whose wife, Amy, went missing. The novel was adapted into the movie by David Fincher, starring Ben Affleck and Rosamund Pike. Fahrenheit 451 is a Ray Bradbury's novel about how mass media ruled the world while literature became illegal. The book criticized US policy during the Cold War, especially McCarthyism. Psycho was a novel about a man named Norman Bates who owned the Bates Motel to lure the victim and kill them. The book was famous for the movie, adapted and directed by Alfred Hitchcock. Something That Get This Way Come is another Ray Bradbury novel about the two 13-year-old best friends, Jim Nightdale and William Holloway, and their nightmarish experience with a traveling carnival that comes to their Midwest town, Greentown, Illinois, on October 24th. In dealing with the creepy figure of this carnival, the boy learned how to combat fear. I Am Legend was a book about a man who was the sole survivor in a world plagued by zombies. This book different from Will Smith's movie version directed by Francis Lawrence. World War Z was an alternate history book depicting an epic war between human and zombie. The book was adapted in two versions. One was a movie version starring Brad Pitt, another a 2019 video game developed by Saber Interactive. The Running Man was a dystopian novel, followed the story of Brent Richard as he participated in the reality show The Running Man. The novel was adapted into the movie starring Arnold Schwarzenegger, and more recently, director Edgar Wright adapted the novel to film, starring Glenn Powell, Katie O'Brien, Daniel Ezra, Carl Guzman, Josh Brolin, Lee Pace, J. Maya Lawson, Michael Cera, Emilia Jones, William H. Macy, David Saya, Sean Hayes, and Coleman Domingo. The film is scheduled to be released by Paramount Pictures on November 7, 2025. You know The Exorcist, both the film and the book version. Dark Matter was a science fiction by Michel Pavard. It's set in London in 1937. Jack Miller is stuck in a dead-end job and jumps at the chance to be a wireless operator on a year-long Arctic expedition to Gurgen on the northeast coast of Svalbard. Bird Box was a post-apocalyptic novel by American writer George Martinman. The book follows a woman who must find a way to guide herself and her children to safety despite the potential threat from an unseen adversary. Nosferatu is a novel by Joe Hill, who was the son of Stephen King, about a woman trying to save her son from a vicious supernatural serial killer. The Metamorphosis is a novel by Franz Kafka about a man who transforms into a cockroach. The story is similar to David Cronenberg's movie, and it's quite to be an early example of body horror novel, which was inspired many directors like David Lynch, David Cronenberg, Joel O'Connell, and even Caroline Fargat, the director who directed the movie The Substance. House of Leaves is a debut novel by American author Mark C. Danielewski. It is about a house where Navidson lives with his wife and two children. One day, the house starts changing, room and hallway expand and contact in weird way, creating a labyrinth within a structure that looked no different from the outside. 100 Days of Sodom was a Marquis de Sade that was famous for the infamous 1975 movie directed by Pier Paolo Pasolini. The novel was a controversial story about a story of a group of elites who kidnapped and tortured a group of teens. You know A Clockwork Orange, both the film and the book version. The narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym of Nantucket is a novel by Edgar Allan Poe about a stowaway on a Nantucket whale ship who finds himself immersed in the dark side of life at sea, mutiny, cannibalism, savagery, and even death. A Dance at the Slaughterhouse was a novel about a private detective who investigated a snuff film ring following the death of a young, beautiful woman. The Road is a Pulitzer Prize-winning novel about a father and son who travel across USA after the apocalypse. Survival is a satirical novel first published in February 1999. The story followed the story of Tender Branson, a member of a Kurdish church, a deaf cow. The Bell Jar was a Silver Plate's only novel about Esther Greenwood, a 19-year-old undergraduate student who suffered from numerous mental health. The book was first published in January 1963 under the presumed Victoria Lucas and later released posthumously under her real name. Still Alice is a 2007 novel about a woman named Alice Holland, a 50-year-old woman who is a cognitive psychology professor at Harvard University and a world-renowned linguistic expert. She is married to an equally successful husband with 3 grown children. When she became increasingly disoriented and forgetful, a tragic diagnosis changed her life and her relationship with her family and the world. American Psycho was a dark comedy novel about Patrick Bateman, a businessman in the late 80s New York, where in reality he was a serial killer who kidnapped, raped, tortured, and murdered many women. The book was famous for the 2000 movie starring Christian Bale and also a musical where Matt Smith played as Patrick Bateman. The Mysterious Stranger is a novella by an American author, Mark Twain, about an angel who appeared to the young Theodore Fisher and his friend in a small Austrian town of Esserford in the 16th century. I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream was a short story about the world being destroyed by a nuclear war or during the heights of the Cold War. Am, an AI during the Cold War, kidnapped 5 humans and forced them to play death games. The book was adapted into the video game in 1995, and if you want to know about the story, check the video that the Wild Side made about I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream. I recommend that video. Lord of the Flies was a novel by British writer William Golding about a group of boys stranded on a desert island after the plane crashes. There are no adults and the boys struggle to live in harmony. They end up fighting for control and ultimately survival. You know the Battle Royale, The Hunchback of Notre Dame, and One Flew Over the Cuckoo Nest, both the novel and the film version. The Painted Bird was a harrowing novel by Jerzy Kosinski about a boy considered gypsy or Jewish stray, wondered about a small village scattered around an unspecified country in Central or Eastern Europe. If you are fans of Come and See, I recommend this book. A Little Life was an epic novel that consists a tragedy. It follows the story of 4 friends who move to the city to propose their passion and find themselves. The novel deals with many social issues such as child prostitution, drug and alcohol addiction, suicide, incest, rape, and many more. Directors like Bradley Colbert, who recently directed The Brutalist and also made the movie Walk Like starring Natalie Portman, should adapt this book onto the big screen. Ring is a Japanese horror novel by Koji Suzuki about 4 teens mysteriously die stimulously in Tokyo. Kazuki Arasawa, a reporter and uncle to one of the deceased, decided to launch his investigation. His search led him to Hakone Pacific Land, a holiday resort where the youth were last seen together exactly 1 week before their death. The King in the Yellow is a short story about a final day of a distant world dynasty, the arrival of the stranger to that city, a masked ball, and the final disastrous arrival of the King in the Yellow. If you are a fan of the Season 1 True Detective, I recommend this short story. The Wind Up Bird Chronicle is one of Murakami's most violent books. It is about a young man named Toru Okada who searched for his wife, missing cat, and then for his wife. In a network bended the city plays surface. As the searches intersect, he encounters a bizarre group of allies and antagonists. Phantom is a horror novel by Dean Koontz about a version of a now debunked urban legend involving a village mysteriously vanishing at Akuni Lake. Blood Meridian is one of my favorite books of all time, and it consists one of Cormac McCarthy's most famous work. It is about a young boy named the Kid who was recruited by the Glanton Gang, which robbed and murdered many people in the 1840s. I made a video about it, check it out. The Bone Collector is a thriller novel by Jeffrey Drever about an ex-homicide detective and his partner trying to track down a brutal serial killer who is terrorizing New York. There was a movie adapted from this novel, starring Denzel Washington and also Angelina Jolie too. We Have Always Lived in a Castle was Cherry Jackson's last novel about a young girl named Mary Kathleen Meerkat Blackwood, who lived with her agoraphobic sister and alienating uncle on an estate 6 years before the novel event. The Blackwood family experienced a tragedy that left the three survivors isolated from their tiny village. The Black Dahlia is James Noel Elroy's most famous book. It is about two police detectives who see their personal and professional life fall apart in the wake of the Black Dahlia murder investigation. It was the first in the LA Quartet series. Johnny Got His Gun was an anti-war novel by Dalton Trumbull about Joe Bonham, a young American soldier serving in World War I, who awakening in a hospital bed after being caught in a blast of an exploding artillery shell. Trumbull later adapted his novel into a movie, which he directed. The Changeling is a novel about a rare book dealer whose life is torn apart after his wife committed an act of violence and vanishes. The Only Good Indian is a 2020 horror book by Stephen Graham Jones. The story is about a Blackfeet man named Ricky who leaves a bar and fights an elk, stumbling into several cars in the parking lot. Fantastic Land was a novel about the theme park where fun is exaggerated, but when a hurricane ravaged the Florida coast and isolated the park, the amplified it anything but fun. The Troop is a Canadian horror novel about 5 teenage boys and their scoutmaster as they spend a weekend always in Falstaff Island, a remote island a short distance from the town where they all live. Our Tomorrow is a book about a world where future human species evolved through natural means, the genetic engineering conducted by humans and a mysterious and superior alien species called the Q. The Cabin at the End of the World is a novel about two dads, Andrew and Alec, and their adopted daughter, Wen. They rented a cabin in an unwild and decompressed in the wilderness. That is, until one day, 4 strangers show up and tell them that a decision must be made to prevent the world from ending. The Last Day is a dystopian thriller set in a world where the Earth has stopped spinning. The Moth Diary is a horror novel by Rachel Klein about an exclusive girl boarding school. In it, a 16-year-old girl records her most intimate thoughts in the diary. The object of her growing obsession is her roommate, Lucy Blake, and Lucy's friendship with their new and disturbing classmate, Ernesta. Ernesta is an economic, moody person with pale skin and hyperkinetic eye. Haunted is a 2005 novel in which each story is followed by a chapter of the main narrative, as told by a character in main narrative, and tied back into the main story in some way. A Scanner Darkly was a cyberpunk novel by Philip K. Dick about Bob Archer, an undercover agent who became addicted to a drug while trying to infiltrate the drug underworld. Blindness is a dystopian novel where people became blind and are sent to a camp that was a former school. Then gangs were formed and people kill each other, women are raped, and children are sold as slaves. Beowulf Children is a science fiction novel by Lally Niven, Jerry Purin, and Steve Bond about a second generation of evolution colonists coming of age, and the potential of teenage rebellion has never been so strong. Clown in the Cornfield is a horror novel about a teenage girl who is a senior high school and has recently moved to a small factory town of Kettle Spring, Missouri from Philadelphia after a tragic death of her mother, Samantha, her father, Glenn, and has been hired as a Utah physician, hoping this will allow the two of them to heal. The Bad Scene is a 1954 horror novel about Rhonda Perlmark, a high-functioning sociopath. Although the term wasn't popular when the book was written, she has no consistent and will not hesitate to harm or kill whoever stand in her way of achieving her goal. Child God is it's a Southern Gothic novel about a lonely man from the Appalachia named Lester Ballard, who had a rogue start and had to fend for himself since childhood, following the abandonment of his mother and the suicide of his father. On the Beach is a dystopian book about the experience of a mixed group of people in Melbourne, Victoria, Australia, as they awaited the arrival of deadly radiation spreading toward them from the Northern Hemisphere, following a nuclear war. Girl Interrupted is a best-selling memoir by Susanna Kaysen, relating to her experience as a young woman in an American psychedelic hospital back in the 60s, after being diagnosed with borderline personality disorder. Pretty Girl is a crime book about a woman who is found naked, badly beaten, and buried alive in the New Mexico mountain. Requiem for a Dream was a novel that Darren Aronofsky adapted into the big screen. And Yes, Saw the Angels was Nick Cave's debut book about the story of a man named Ulysses Etro who finds more compassion in the family meal than his fellow men. We need to talk about Kevin was a novel about a mom whose son was a mass murderer who killed his dad and his sister with a baseball bat and committed a school shooting with an AK-47 that he bought from the black market. A Boy and His Dog was a novel from which Fallout and Mad Max were inspired from. Burn Shadow followed the intersecting history of two families, beginning in the final day of the World War II in Japan, following to India on the brink of partition of 1947, to Pakistan in the early 1980s, and then New York in the aftermath of the September 11 attack, and Afghanistan in the wake of the US invasion. The Third Policeman is a classic Irish novel of man accused of robbery and murder. The House on the Borderland is a supernatural horror novel about a story of a remote houses and a man whose experience with mystical creature and ultraviolet dimension. Blindside was a hard science fiction novel that was a realistic look on the alien occupation of Earth. Distant Star was a 1996 novel by Roberto Bolaño about the story of Arturo B, who tells the story of Alberto Ruiz Tanger, an aviator who explored the 1973 Chilean coups to launch his version of the new Chilean poetry. Less Than Zero is Bert Easton Ellis' debut novel, following the life of Clay, a wealthy young college student who returned to his hometown in LA for winter break in 1984. Through first-person narration, Clay described his progressive alienation from the culture around him, his loss of faith in his friend, and his meditation on the event in his recent past. My Work Is Not Done Yet is a novel about corporate horror and demonic retribution. Red Man Notebook is a 1968 short horror novel. It features an unnamed social misfit who relates better to rat than human. The Rune is a 2006 horror novel by Scott Smith, set in Mexico Yucatan Peninsula. The book fit perfectly into the survival horror genre. Carton Comfort is a horror novel about a tiny fraction of humanity that has immersed physic power, which they refers to as the ability. Wait Till Helen Come is a 1986 novel about a young girl who must deal with supernatural events surrounding her. Rage was one of the most infamous Stephen King novels that inspired many mass shootings around the world. Naked Lunch is a novel that follows the story of William Lee, who has an opioid addiction and traveled to the surreal city of Interzone and began working for the organization Islam Inc. The Wasp Factory is a novel told from the perspective of 16-year-old Frank Clotham. Frank lived with his father on a small island in rural Scotland and has not seen his mother in many years. The Great God Plan is an 1894 horror and fantasy novella by Arthur McCain about Dr. Raymond performing a botched experiment in late Victorian brain surgery. Outer Darks is the second novel by Cormac McCarthy, published in 1968. The time and setting are nebulous, but can be assumed to be somewhere in Appalachia, sometimes around the turn of the 20th century. The novel tells a story of a woman named Rinty who bears her brother's baby. 2666 is a final novel by Roberto Bolaño. The book revolves around the elusive German author and the unsolved and ongoing murder of women in the fictional Mexican town of Santa Teresa that was inspired from Ciudad Juárez. That the novel was disturbing because the depiction of the murder of their victims, similarly to True Detectives. Lolita is a novel by Russian novelist Vladimir Nabokov that addressed the controversial subject, pedophiles. It is about the story of a Frenchman named Humbert who obsessed with a young girl named Dorothy Hayes. The novel was so controversial, even Nabokov was get a death threat. Filth followed the story of Bruce, a young police officer who embodied everything bad. He mistreated and used everyone around him in the worst way. There was a movie about that was based on this novel, starring James McAvoy. You know the plot of the Right Ones Inn and Hell Houses. Living Death Girl is a young adult novel, follows the story of a girl named Alice who has been kidnapped by the pedophiles. Thirsty is a horror novel by M.T. Anderson set in modern Clayton, Massachusetts. The main character, Christopher, wants an everyday life to date his crush Rebecca Schwartz, stay up late and do other teenage things. Boot Camps is a young adult novel about a boy who is subject to physical and psychological abuse. The Cement Garden is about the father of 4 children dying. About a year later, the children's mothers also die. To avoid being taken into foster care, the children hide their mother's death from the outside world by encasing her corpse in cement in the cellar. The End of Alice is a 1996 novel by A.M. Holmes. It was published in the United States and by Scrubber and in the UK by Anchor Book. The story is narrated mostly by the middle-aged pedophile and child killer who is serving a life sentence. I don't know the plot of the provocateur was like. Journal to the End of the Night is the first novel by Louis Ferdinand Céline. This semi-autobiographical work followed the adventures of Ferdinand Barbauld during the First World War in colonial Africa, the US, and poor suburb of Paris. The Girl Next Door was a 1989 novel by Jack Ketchum. It is loosely based on the 1965 infamous murder of Sylvia Larkin. The Devil All the Time was Donald Ray Pollock's Southern Gothic crime novel. It will follow this spirited character in the post-World War II Southern Ohio and West Virginia, including a disturbed war veteran, a husband and wife who are serial killer, and an abusive preacher. There was a movie adaptation of the same name directed by Antonio Campos and narrated by Pollock, starring Tom Holland, Sebastian Stan, Robert Pattinson, Bill Skarsgård, Riley Lowe, Haley Bennett, and Mia Wasikowska. Exquisite Crops is a horror novel by American writer Bobby C. Bright. The protagonist of the novel is Andrew Compton, a British serial killer, cannibal, and necrophiliac. Bright has described it as a necrophiliac cannibalistic serial killer love story. If you don't like this novel, I don't recommend to read this book because the book was glorifying the way of the serial killer, similarly to how some book glorifying dictators like that. The Girl with All the Gift is an M.R. Carey novel based on his 2013 Edgar Award nomination short story and was written concurrently with the screenplay for the 2016 film. It deals with a dystopian future which most of humanity is wiped out by a zombie-like fungal infection. Mr. Be Gone is a short metafiction by Clive Barker, the man who wrote Hellraiser. The cipher follows the story of Nicholas and Dakota, who discover a mysterious hole in a storage room they call the Fun Hole, and descended into obsession, violence, and transformation as they explore it deep. Gone to See the Riverman follow Rolly and her obsession with and corresponds then with a serial killer, Ed Moon. The Sheep Look Up is a science fiction book about first published in 1972. The novel decidedly dystopian and deals with the deterioration of the environment in the United States. The Killing Star is a hard science fiction novel published in 1995. It chronicles a sudden alien invasion in the late 21st century. Utopia, a novel of terrible optimism, was a novel about the story of eugenics. Flicker is a novel published in 1991. The story covers approximately 15 to 20 years of the life of the film scholar Jonathan Yates, whose academic investigation draw him into the world of historic conspiracy that underlie the work of the fictional B-movie director Max Castle. Sharp Object was a Gillian Flynn's debut novel, followed the story of Camille Parker, a newspaper journalist who returned to her hometown to report a series of brutal murder. There was an HBO show adapted from this novel, starring Amy Adams as Camille. Never Let Me Go is a Kazuto Ishiguro 6 novel, set in England during the 90s. It followed the story of student life at an elite boarding school. The story explores themes of friendships, memory, and what it means to be human, gradually revealing more profound mystery about the nature of the world. The book was adapted into film by director Mark Romante, and the screenplay was written by the famous Alex Garland, starring Keira Knightley, Carey Mulligan, and Andrew Garfield. Perfume was Kurt Cobain's favorite novel of a man in the 18th century France who kidnapped and murdered women for their beauties and used their body to make perfume. What made the novel was disturbing because the main protagonist was a depraved serial killer. I Am Behind You follow four very different families as they wake up in their caravan one morning and are not where they should be. The other is a horror novel by Thomas Tyrone set in the 30s. It focuses on the sadistic relationship between two 13-year-old identical twin boys. Tendencies Flesh is an Argentinian dystopian novel. It was initially published in Spanish in 2017 and translated into English in 2020. The book portrayed a society where a virus had containment all animal meat. Because of the lack of animal flesh, cannibalism became legal. Margot, a human meat supplier, is conflicted by this new society and tortured by his losses. The Beach Dog tells the story of Zoe and Bertram, two dogs who are being pursued by a lively mongrel Jack. Elect Mr. Robinson for a Better World was a novel by Donald Antrim. It is Antrim's first novel. The novel depicts the grisly and occasionally surreal misadventure of a downside school teacher, Pete Robinson, in a vaguely post-apocalyptic America. Time Cemetery followed the story of 20 years of trying to forget that night, that hellish night of unimaginable horror. The Virgin Suicide was a novel that Sofia Coppola adapted into movie. The novel took place in the 1970s Michigan, centered the life of five doomed sisters, the Lisbon Girl. The Slut is a novel by Dennis Cooper. The novel composed of internet forum, transcription of tape recording, and private email. The focus is on Brett, a gay male sex worker. Stories of the Eye is a novella by Josh Bailey that details the increasingly bizarre sexual perversion of a pair of teenage lovers. Zombie is a 1995 horror novel by Joyce Carol Oates that explores the mind of a serial killer. The serial killer was based on the infamous Jeffrey Dahmer. Black Easter is a fantasy novel by James Billish in which an arms dealer hires a black magician to unleash all the demons of hell on earth for a single day. The novel initially depicts the assassination of the governor of California by a black magician working as a contract killer. The same magician is then hired to release every demon in hell for a brief period. However, the demon cannot be returned to hell by the end of the novel. Their traditional opponent, God, has already retired and nobody else can compel them to return to hell. Coin Locker Baby is a novel by Rune Murakami about coin-operated rocker baby. Tamba was a novel about Celeste Price who groomed and molested one of her young male students. I want director Sean Baker, who won the Academy Award from the movie Anora, to adapt this novel into the big screen, starring Alice Eve as Celeste Price. And it will be an NC-17 movie. You believe that? Or if not Alice Eve, Betty Gilpin or Smara Weaving as Celeste Price. Equine is a 1973 play by Peter Schaefer about a child psychiatrist attempting to treat a young man with a pathological religious fascination with horses. Ao tells the tale of four women working in the graveyard shift at a Japanese bento factory. All four women live complex life. Masako, the leader of the four women, felt completely alienated from her estranged husband and teenage son. Kuniko, a plump and rather vain girl, was recently ditched by her boyfriend. After a couple was driven into debt, leaving Kuniko to fins of a lone child. Yoshi is a single mother and lukewarm caretaker of her mother-in-law, who was left partly paralyzed after a stroke. Yayoi is a 34-year-old mother of two small boys, who she is forced to leave home alone, where they are abused by their drunken, gambling father, Kenji. Beloved is a Toni Morrison's most famous novel, tells the story of a dysfunctional family of formerly enslaved people whose Cincinnati home is haunted by a malevolent spirit. The narrative of Beloved derived from the life of Margaret Gardner, an enslaved person in the slave state of Kentucky, who escaped and fled to the free state of Ohio in 1856. Such Night People tell the story of Tom Nash, the 17-year-old son of Anne and Cole, who planned the murder of his family, a nightmare he has been secretly living for months. Last Exit to Brooklyn is a harsh, uncompromising look at a low-class Brooklyn in the 1950s, written in spare, stripped-down poses. The novel followed the story of 6 chapters. And chapter 1, Another Day, Another Dollar, was a story of a gang of young Brooklyn hoodlums hang around an all-night diner and get into a vicious fight with a group of army soldiers on leave. Chapter 2, The Queen is Dead, is a story of a transgender hooker is thrown out of the family home by her homophobic brother and try to attract the attraction of a ruthless hoodlum named Vinny and a benzene-driven party. Chapter 3, And Baby Bakes 3, tells the story of an unknown narrator about a couple, Susie and Tommy, who have a baby out of wedlock. Chapter 4, Tarala, is a story of Tarala, a young Brooklyn prostitute who make a living proposition seller in bar and stealing their money. In perhaps the novel's most infamous scene, she is brutally gang raped after a night of heavy drinking. She is left out for dead in a vacant lot. Chapter 5, Strike, is the story of Harry, a machinist in a factory, become a local officer in the union. He is a closet gay man. He abused his wife and he tried to boast of his accomplishment and his high status to anyone who might listen to convince himself that he is a man. And chapter 6, Larsson, described as a coda for the book. This section presents the intervened yet ordinary day of numerous incidents in a housing project. The Collector is a psychological thriller novel by John Le. Its plot follows a lonely young man who kidnaps a female art student in London and holds her captive in the cellar of his rural farmhouse. Divided into 2 sections, the novel contains both the perspective of the captor, Frederick, and that of Miranda, the captive. The portions of the book told from Miranda's perspective is presented in estopholic form. The novel was inspired by many serial killers such as Leonard Lake and Charles Ning, as well as Robert Badera. No Sanctuary is about a couple named Bert and Rick who venture out to the wood on their vacation. Negative Space is about a group of friends who live in Kingsfield, New Hampshire. The friends are no stranger to drugs. They All Die Screaming is a plague novel by Splatterpunk award-winning author Christopher Triana. Mysterious Skin followed 2 pre-adolescent boys who both experienced a strange event. The novel was famous for a Greg Arrakis movie. The Killer Inside Me is a 1952 Southern Gothic novel by Jim Thompson. It follows the story of Lou Ford, who appeared to be an unremarkable deputy sheriff in a small Texas town. Benedict is fascinated. However, he is a cunning, depraved sociopath with sadistic sexual tastes. His main outlet for his dark urges is the relatively malignant habit of deliberately needling people with cliches and platitudes despite their apparent boredom. If they're anything worse than a bore, say Lou is a corny bore. The Least of My Sky is about William Colton Hughes. He's a serial killer, but he's rather skipped the stalking of his prey and the body disposal portion of the game. Othering follows Natsuki, a young girl who doesn't quite fit in. On an annual family visit, her cousin, Yui, confided that he felt the same way and believed himself to be an alien. The White Hotel is told principally through an erotic journal and letter between the female narrator and the fictionalized Sigmund Freud, as well as Freud case history analysis of the narrator. I'm thinking the ending thing follows the story of a young woman who has many doubts about her relationship with her boyfriend. Despite her reservation, she takes a road trip with him to meet his parents. The book was adapted into a film written by Charlie Kaufman and starring Jesse Plemons, Jesse Buckley, Toni Collette, and David Tewlis. Drive your plow over the bone of the dead. Follow an eccentric recluse in a village on the Czech-Polish border who convinced she knows why dead bodies keep turning up around her. Hawks is a novel by Samuel R. Delaney, written in '69 and completed in '95. The novel deals graphically with themes of murder, child molestation, incest, chorophobia, chorophagin, eugenia, anal oral contact, necrophilia, and rape. Proxy was a novel by Pete Sotos. Scorched as Last is a work of post-apocalyptic fiction with a disempowering outlook. Count follows the story of a mother, a son, and a paralyzed dog. Monstrously fat and murderously driven, referred to only as the Hagsbees. Disgrace follows the story of David Rowley, a white South African professor of English who loses everything: his reputation, his job, his peace of mind, his dream of artistic success, and finally, even his ability to protect his daughter. Frenzy follows a camper trying to survive a rapid animal attack. The Sweet Sickness is a psychological thriller by Patricia Highsmith, who wrote Tom Ripley novel series about a man obsessed with a woman who has rejected his advance. It is a painful novel about obsessive imaginary love. Gemma follows Hazen Wood, who kidnapped 12-year-old Gemma Sullivan. The 2-week embark upon a cross-country journey that tests the limit of Gemma's endurance. In graphic scenes of physical and sexual violence, Hazen tries to destroy the young girl village. Piercing follows Kawashima Miyazaki, trying to come with terms to his overwhelming desire to stab his infant child with an ice pick. He resolved to divert the impulse into an unsuspecting prostitute. However, as he began to execute his crime, everything, including his past, began to unravel. The results follow the Turban family, including Lovell, Rachel, and their 3 sons. They find their off-season vacation at an isolated resort in the Arizona desert. Audition follow. A video is offered the opportunity to screen girl at a special audition arranged by a friend to find him a new wife. Room is a novel by Emma Donoghue. The story is told from the perspective of a 5-year-old boy named Jack, who is being held captive in a small room along with his mom. Donoghue convinced the story after hearing about the story of the infamous Joseph Fritzl cases in Austria. Come Closer is told the first person from the perspective of Amanda, a young woman who slowly began to realize a demon possessed her. Tiger is a novel that tells the graphic account of an absurd child relationship with a 51-year-old pedophile. In the Miso Soup follow the story of Kenji, a Japanese nightlife guide for foreigners who navigated gaijin men around the sex club and hostless bar of Tokyo. On December 29, he received a phone call from an American man named Frank who seeks 3 nights of his service. While Kenji has promised to spend more time with his girlfriend, 16-year-old June, the money is too good to pass up. He finds himself closing out the end of the year. Frank out Shinjuku, wondering if his strange plastic-skinned patron could be responsible for their murder. Maynard's Houses is a horror novel about a young Vietnam vet, Austin, suffering from the PTSD, who learned that his best friend, Maynard, has been killed in combat. The Son of Maradoro is a book with no logical plot. It is divided into 6 cantos that focus primarily on the psychic Maradoro, an incarnation of evil who openly rejects God and humanity. The Consumer is a collection of short pieces, sort of like story but more like wild fantasy. The Obscene Bird of Night is the most acclaimed novel by Jose Donoso. Donoso was a member of Latin American boom. Let Go Play at the Adam is a horror novel by Meadow W. Johnson and originally published by Thomas Y. Cromwell. Its plot focuses a group of rural Maryland children who drunk, incapacitated, and eventually tortured the college student baby sister hired by their parents while they are away in Europe for 2 weeks. It sounds familiar like Junko Furuta cases. Tombs for 500,000 Soldiers was a novel based on Pierre Goutelat's experience as a soldier during the Algerian War. The book earned a cult reputation. It became the subject of various controversy, primarily because of the themes. The Notebook trilogy is a collection of a book written in French by a Hungarian writer, Agota Christoph. It tells the story of initially unnamed identical twin brothers who lived with their grandmother in a small village and border town of a war-torn country during an unspecified war. Throughout their journey, the boy expressed a singularly naive ethical stance that is stimulously immoral and generous. The second and third book reveal the twins' names as Klaus and Lucia, or Lucas. The setting in the first and second novel is mostly like a fictionalized version of a Hungarian village, and that unsophisticated war is believed to be the Second World War. Querelle of Brest follows the story of George Joe Querelle, a sailor on the cargo ship Le Vinegar. Querelle is also a thief, prostitute, opium smuggler, and a serial killer. While he kills for money, his primary motive for murder is the sheer liberating pleasure he experienced from it. He killed to feel alive. The book was famous for its film adaptation, directed by Rainier Werner Fassbinder, and the movie version was his last movie before he died from a cocaine overdose. Wonderful Time followed a group of four Vietnamese teens during the 50s as they violently engaged with the previous generation, the post-World War II legacy. The novel does not use traditional chapter declamation and focus mainly on the character. Internal told through the portrayal of the Austrian family, Vygotsky, the reader can see the relationship between deadly fascism with the family and undigested Austrian National Socialist history. The family patriarch, a former Nazi, make up for his loss of power and one leg by terrorizing his family and sexually abusing his wife. Josh Milley's Circle is a sequel of 5 semi-autobiographical novels by Dennis Cooper. No Longer Human tells the story of a troubled man incapable of revealing his true self of author and who instead maintains a facade of hollow jocularity, later turning to a life of alcoholism and drug abuse. The Big Hate is a horror novel by Edward Lee. This Perfect Day by Ira Levin depicts a chilling, dystopian future in which a central computer controls a global society. Bunny follows the story of Samantha, a master of fine art and creative writing student. The Brave is a novel about where armed guard patrol a dump to prevent low-income families from wandering through the garbage. And that is the video. I know that this is the first video in the Iceberg video that I made. The last video that I made was government cover Iceberg, and quite you may know about that. I love to reading books. And if you are having some disturbing book recommended for me, please comment on my comment section of that video. And if somehow was inaccurate, I want to apologize about that. And thank you for watching, motherfucker.